It's obvious that some coaching staff changes are needed for the Cincinnati Bengals. To what extent are those coaching staff changes needed, and does it stop there? Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. Together, we are the Locked On Bengals podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcasts. And today, as we dive into the coaching staff changes that are necessary for this team to take steps back to the right direction with Joe Burrow at quarterback in this Joe Burrow era, we want to welcome back the everydayers. We want to welcome in those of you who make us your first listen, and welcome the new listeners who can subscribe to the show wherever they get their podcasts or on YouTube to make sure they don't miss an episode. And we'll have a lot to talk about the rest of the way here as a potential tumultuous offseason is coming up. Last year, we talked about the offseason, James, as one of significant importance to the future of this franchise. They failed that test. They had a lot of holes to fill. They did not fill them adequately. And now at 4-8, they're facing down another offseason that will be vitally important to get the organization back on the right track. In a year where Joe Burrow is playing quarterback, like the elite quarterback we know he is, at the top of the NFL in most statistical categories, in most quarterback ranking categories, in most grading categories you can think about, despite his efforts, this team is very blatantly, obviously not good enough. And at that point, we look to the coaching staff and probably beyond if we're taking a whole picture approach, but we're starting with the coaching staff because it's obvious, as we said yesterday, that major changes are needed for this team to get back on track.
Yeah, let's start here. I don't want to hear, and I'm not saying there are a lot of people that are going to say this, but you hinted at the front office just now. The front office definitely deserves blame. But with the Bengals, you better believe Lou Anarumo was on board with Geno Stone. Lou Anarumo was on board with Nick Scott a year ago. Lou Anarumo is certainly on board with the Jordan Battle pick and some of these other guys that they've picked. The point is the coaching staff has a hand in the grocery picking. They are in the room. They are in the free agent discussions when the Bengals are identifying targets. And by the way, it's not just Lou, Zach, the Frank Pollock, the offensive staff, everybody. My point is everyone deserves blame here. They do, because they're a flawed football team. As good as they've been on offense, it's really a few guys. It's not like their offense is just this unstoppable force because they're this well-oiled, well-run, unstoppable, just juggernaut where all 11 guys are awesome. We know that's not the case. Or 12. We'll include Zac Taylor in that since he's the one calling the plays. We know that that's not the case. And yet, you have guys that can do the heavy lifting, that can get you to 30-plus points per game and nearly 29 points per game in their 8 losses this year. So, yeah, I think about that. I think about if we're talking Thanksgiving just passed, but if we're doing a blame pie, and I think there's a lot of slices. And that's the unfortunate part to me, Jake, is I really wish I could just point to Frank Pollock or Lou Anarumo or the Charles Burks or the front office, the GM or this guy or that. You can't. There's so much to go. Like there's so many tentacles and so much blame, and everyone's getting at least a little slice, that it's really tough to point at one thing or one guy or one coach or one player. I wish it was just Geno Stone because that's an easy fix, I think. You just need a safety. Or if it was just, you shouldn't have paid Jermaine Pratt, who tackles, what missed tackles? But it's not. There are so many issues. And that's what sucks, is when you look at it, at least from my December 2nd as we record this view, it's really tough to look at it and say, all right, well, this is the solution. Because there's so many different things going on. I don't know if you feel that way, but it's really like I'm looking at the top of Everest and I haven't even started the trek. And that's pretty intimidating.
Yeah, it's a multitude of issues and a lack of cornerstone players to build around. You've got Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, but then other homegrown players that turned out to be either at the top of their position or very near it are on their way out. And T. Higgins and Jesse Bates in recent history, and the choice of which players to keep or the efforts to make those contract decisions around guaranteed money that goes to the front office, right? But the results we've seen on the field this year don't need to be what we've seen. The record in one score games has totally regressed, right? From being slightly above 500 in one score games in the last few years to 1-7 this year. All the stats we talked about yesterday and the offense scoring all these points. But as you point out, it's not like the offense is this juggernaut that looks super clean and perfect all the time. This is Joe Burrow doing Herculean, superhuman effort kind of things. This is studs on the outside making stud plays on the outside, and everyone else is just a roller coaster at best. The run game was actually pretty good against the Steelers, right? Like there were some really nice run lanes opened up by this offensive line. Some of the changes they made in personnel, maybe that helped there, right? Maybe they actually found the right lever to pull for their offensive line configuration and moving Cody Ford to left guard. Maybe they shouldn't have taken that long. Maybe they had to wait that long because Orlando Brown is clearly still dealing with the injury, right? But there's a roller coaster outside of your guys that are at the top of their position. And so when collectively, yes, we can recognize that there are talent deficiency issues, but collectively, you're getting consistently a sum that is less than your parts. That's where you turn your attention to the coaching staff, right? And we talked today about these obvious examples on the defensive side of the ball, or over the last couple of seasons, obvious issues in the offensive structure where the run game isn't married well to the pass game, or they can't or won't use the play action game or screen game, or they're in all these drop back situations all the time that puts a ton of pressure on the offensive line and Joe Burrow and the outside receivers, right? To just win one-on-ones. And that's like the structure of the offense. And beyond that, as we started to allude to yesterday, James, you can get to development issues across the board. And those are more nebulous and more difficult to quantify because you don't know exactly what's happening behind the scenes. You don't know for all of these guys. Some of them are just bad picks. Some of them are players that had promising profiles and then haven't developed in Cincinnati. And you take all of that into account. And then we get to that question of like, well, is there any part of this coaching staff that at this point has earned the right based on the last couple of years to return based on the direction things are going?
Yeah, I think that's where I'm at. I know a lot of people are focused on Lou or the defensive coaching staff, and they just focus there. And I think it's bigger than that, or potentially at least should be bigger than that. And there's a bigger conversation before you get to Lou. And funny enough, Jake, this is a conversation we had on this podcast after the 2020 season, after Joe got hurt. It's like, all right, well, do you do this or do you take it another step? And the Bengals didn't. But you know what they did is they nailed free agency in the draft. And by nailing it, it's you get a guy, a franchise changer in Jamar Chase that completely changes the vibe, and your quarterback is upright and all of those things. So there's a lot there, and I think we should have that discussion. I have some thoughts on that. Obviously, we're talking about Zac and Zac Taylor's future. We'll get there coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the app you need. It's daily fantasy the way it should be. The best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. All you do is pick more or less on at least two players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You can run your game all season long with PrizePicks. So let's just say it's Bengals and Cowboys, and you think that Jamar Chase is going to have another big day. Well, you pick more on his PrizePicks receiving yards projection. Maybe you think Joe Burrow is going to throw for 1 billion yards against the Cowboys. Well, you could just combine those two, and boom, that is your PrizePicks pick. It is simple. All you have to do is download the PrizePicks app and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the PrizePicks app and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game.
A lot to get into with this coaching staff discussion, probably some nuance required. But as you're hinting at, James, there's this big, broad question that probably comes first.
Yeah, for sure. And it's, should you keep Zac Taylor? And that's where it should start, is when you discuss Lou or Frank or any of these guys. All right, well, let's start with Zac Taylor. And there's plenty of graphics going around. His record in one-score games you mentioned on our post-game show, his record against AFC North teams, those things coming back after a few years of them being kind of hidden during 21 and 22 because of the runs they went on. And look, there's nuance to that. You could say Burrow hurt or Burrow this or pre-Burrow. Fine. But I think it's even simpler than that. When asking the Zac Taylor question, if you're really having a question about Lou or Frank or any of these guys, because you can defend any of these coaches. I could defend Lou very easily if you wanted to make that case. Defend Frank very easily. I could defend Marion Hobby. I could defend Zach, obviously. So could go there. All right. You could put all the blame on the front office. Like, there's a bunch of ways to do it. But if you're looking at the coaching staff, I think it's pretty simple. All right, if you retool around Zach, is he a top 5 head coach in the NFL? Let's say you nail the defensive coordinator replacement and you nail the offensive line coach, or you nail the entire defensive reboot that some have pitched and said. I don't think he's a top 5 coach in the NFL. Is he a top 10 head coach in the NFL? I think that's a reach. Is he the best coach in the AFC North? No. Second best coach in the AFC North? Probably not. Third? Well, that guy's probably Kevin Stefanski, who has 2 Coach of the Year awards and a dumpster fire in Cleveland. Maybe not. Maybe you make the case that he's third, but that's still, you don't feel great about that. And so I think that's the discussion that I would have if I was in the Bengals front office. That doesn't mean I'm not calling for Zach's job, but I think that's where the discussion starts before you get to, oh, Lou should be fired today. And that's what a lot of people said on Sunday after the game. Before I get there, if I'm the Bengals front office, I start with Zach and I have that conversation. Regardless of his contract, they have plenty of money. And I dismiss that anytime people bring up money. They could pay Zach and also have another head coach in place. Not saying they will, but you need to have that conversation. And I think that's where I start anytime the coaches have been brought up. And that's why, honestly, and you know this, Jake, I've been reluctant to publicly discuss this, because that's where it starts. It doesn't start with an offensive line coach or some assistant. It starts with the head coach, and it goes from there. And I think that's where, if I'm the Bengals front office, if you're having these discussions, that's where you should start.
Yeah, and if you're interested in the other perspective and not getting into necessarily what I believe or don't believe in this particular instance of me making this devil's advocate claim, you could say, well, the offense is still performing at a really high level. We talked earlier in this very show about how, yeah, they're getting results from the offense, but the offense is not entirely, but a lot of Joe Burrow going Superman, a lot of Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins going Superman. And we still have some of the structural issues that we've had with this offense that we've talked about in the past, with the run game marriage to the pass game and all these other issues that we've talked about this year, where it doesn't feel like they're necessarily getting a ton in structure at times.
Yeah.
But sometimes they do, and plenty of time they do. And a lot of the issues you can actually boil down to protection instead of necessarily the structure of the offense. But then how much does the structure of the offense put on the protection in the first place? But despite all of those questions and ways that you can pick apart the offense and say, well, is it in spite of Zach or because of Zach and his offense and his offensive approach? They're getting results. You could also say, well, and this was always the thing with Marvin Lewis, right? Is given the structure of the Bengals, given what their front office is, given the way they operate, given the way that we don't hear from Duke Tobin throughout the year, and Zac Taylor is thus forced to play intermediary in the media and is potentially in the middle of upper management and the players, doing some middle management kind of stuff as the head coach in Cincinnati. That's part of the job description of the head coach in Cincinnati is taking on more front office duties. We saw that with Marvin Lewis too. Then you get this question, same question we have with Marvin Lewis. What coach do they bring into that job that can do all of those things in addition to whatever's required of a head coach? And the answer probably exists. I'm not saying this is like an impossible question. That's not why I bring it up. But it's a question that the Bengals are thinking about when they're thinking about, do we want to pay 2 head coaches this year to do that job? And do we feel like there's still enough shared vision between the front office and Duke Tobin's staff and ownership? I'm including ownership when I say front office, like Brown, Blackburn family, Duke Tobin staff, Zac Taylor vision. Like, is that still aligned like it was when we heard them talk about how aligned they were with those things when Zac was hired, right? And those are the questions that the front office has to be thinking about.
I think it's really hard for me to think that the front office and the coaching staff is as aligned when you have picks like Dax Hill, right? And we've done a ton this offseason on Dax Hill, but that's just an example, right? If you have these free agent whiffs where it's like, well, Geno Stone, you knew he was going to play deep safety. Like, that's why you brought him in. The front office doesn't keep Jesse. Well, Lou wanted Jesse. That's the argument for Lou, right? Lou clearly wanted to keep Jesse Bates. I think Lou would have kept Jesse Bates over say, Logan Wilson or Jermaine Pratt. Maybe I'm wrong. I haven't asked Lou that directly. I'm not sure he would give me that answer, but I'm sure he would have rather had Jesse Bates. And that's the point, is it's like, all right, well, can you see, can they align completely? Because if they had been in alignment from the jump, maybe Dax Hill just plays corner from the get-go, right? Maybe they don't think Nick Scott can be that deep safety, or maybe they go a different route with some of these draft picks. There's so many things, but I think the other element to the Zac conversation before we get more to Lou is, and you mentioned the offense as part of the defense of Zac, and I totally agree, but he's the head coach.
Yeah, he's not the OC. That's exactly it.
He's the head coach.
Yeah.
And so, like, it's like, oh yeah, well, Zac's offense. Oh, well, great. He's the head coach. And I know you're not saying this, but like, that's what's frustrating, is it's like, okay, well, if Lou is sucking, well, then Zac, fix it. That's part of your job. And that's where it starts. Like, it's not, oh, well, Lou is the head defensive coach and Zac is the head offensive coach. That's not how it works.
Feels
and
that
I promise
way, though,
you,
doesn't it?
It does feel that way. And I promise you that's not how the paychecks work either.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to that, and a number of years and all of those things that certainly matter, that's why I start with Zac. Is I'm not splitting the team. It starts and it ends with the head coach. The awareness, the lack thereof, the accountability, all of those things. That's where it starts and ends. That's part of Zac's job. It just is. And I like Zac. And if you could tell, I'm like, because it irks me to have this conversation, but they shouldn't be 4-8. The defense shouldn't stink. And that starts with Zac, not Lou. That's it. It does start with Zac. I think we forget that. By the way, if the Bengals offense stunk 10 years ago, and in 14, heck, it did by the end of the year, but that starts with Marvin. It doesn't start with the OC, which was Hugh Jackson at the time. It does start with Marvin, even though he's a defensive-minded coach, because he's the head coach. Well, it's no different.
With defensive coaches, with Marvin, like, it was Marvin that was making go, no-go decisions on 4th down, for example. So where offensive coaches, like, they're kind of excused for defensive decisions like that, if it was a defensive head coach instead who has the final say on what are we doing from a game management perspective, that's still, like, those decisions are more obvious on offense, which is one way to think about, like, the disparity of head coaching responsibility for the entire team. If it's a defensive coach, some of those decisions are more obvious because they come on the offensive side of the ball, whereas Zac is I assume much more hands off with some of those critical defensive decision-making points, but he's still the head coach, right? And that's why you have to put the entire team's accountability up to the head coach.
Yep. Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. We'll continue to have the conversation. We'll dive into what Lou Anarumo his future and some of these other coaches as well coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sports book for a reason. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. So, well, there's a ton of NFL games between now and Monday Night Football against the Cowboys. The Bengals are favored, by the way. Opened up 6-point favorites, Jake Liscow. What? Yeah, they're favored in Dallas. So maybe you think that they're going to handle business. Maybe not. Well, place $5 on any NBA game, any college football game, any, dare I say it, NFL game, and then you get $150 in bonus bets that you can use on anything. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place, from stats, live play-by-play, and so much more on the same screen that you'll make those bets. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com to join today. Again, that's FanDuel.com. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet at FanDuel.com.
I've got one last shout out to John Sharon for this stat, but
Oh boy.
On the whole
I'm
head
scared.
coaching conversation, the Zac
I'm
Taylor
scared.
conversation.
Yeah, I'm scared about this one. Not because it's John, just because if you 20 minutes in are bringing up a stat, this can't be good. Go.
I wanted to bring it up earlier, but we never found the segue, and then we have that little moment to reset and think about it for a second. But on September 23rd, John tweeted this, and he brought it back yesterday after the game. No QB coaching staff pairing, so Joe Burrow and the Zac Taylor staff, has ever won their first Super Bowl after the first 5 years together.
Yep.
We are beyond that point now. And not to say that Joe Burrow can't be the exception. He's been the exception to so many things, so many Cincinnati Bengals things in particular. And so has Zac. If Joe is the exception, then so is Zac. And that pairing has been the exception to many Cincinnati Bengals ways of being. But this one, sure, they could be the exception again.
Yep.
It gets increasingly hard to see that path.
Yeah, I was aware of that stat, and it's been in the back of my mind throughout this season. And, this was one of those years. There's a reason we talked about the things we did this offseason, and everydayers know it. If you're new, that's fine. But it was such a crucial year, and they just whiffed in free agency. Everything that could go wrong essentially went wrong. And that doesn't mean everybody was a whiff. Like I still like the Mike Gesicki signing, and he is exactly what you hoped he would be when you need him to be that. But most of these, Geno Stone, rough. Sheldon Rankins, illness. Hope you feel better, by the way. It's a very serious illness I think he's dealing with. But those are whiffs, and they weren't in position to do that. They don't have the depth to do that. And that's why I start with Zac. And then you go to Lou and Marion Hobby and all of that. But that's a good one because it points out kind of what I was going back to. If you don't think Zac is let's just say top 10 NFL head coach, and I would say he's probably fourth in the division, in a division with really good head coaches. Like Mike Tomlin's an elite head coach. John Harbaugh's an elite head coach. I think Kevin Stefanski is a good head coach. But if Zac Taylor's an average head coach, do you retool around average? Like, is that the plan? Is that the plan that gets you to a Super Bowl? I think that's the real conversation that needs to be had. And obviously, if the answer is that's not the plan and you go away from Zac, then you're going away from Lou as well. But I think a lot of people certainly think that they should move on from Lou Anarumo.
And you look at other organizations' decisions around head coaching changes. Mm-hmm. It sometimes is hard. Like sometimes it's a coach that you think is a good coach. And sometimes you just need a change. Sometimes you just need a reset. Sometimes you need a different voice. And it could be as simple as that. It could be not that Zac is a bad coach. Maybe Zac is actually a great coach. And maybe due to events in and outside of his control over the last few years, that necessitates a change. But you wanted to talk about Lou Anarumo. So maybe, and I think we should. And so maybe the decision-making eventually is that we think Zac is actually a good coach. And that's what the front office decides. but they look at the results on the defensive side of the ball and they're like, there's no way we can excuse this year. This is the worst defense we've seen since we fired a defensive coordinator midseason in Terrell Austin. And if that didn't exist, like I said yesterday, you'd have to go a whole lot further back to find a defense that has played the way this defense played in crucial spots and is clearly lacking at every level of the defense.
Yeah.
At that point, you have to make a change there. And then you think about like, well, we've brought this example up a few times, and it's not a perfect example because Nick Sirianni also fired his offensive coordinator. But like, is that kind of like, is it a half measure if you totally retool the defensive staff and start over on the defensive staff with new culture requirements and new, figuring out the relationship between Zach and that new DC? Like that seems daunting too to me. But say that's the direction they choose to go. What are the thoughts there, James?
Do you trust that Philly is going to outcoach whoever they play in the NFC playoffs?
Which is,
and
think about Detroit.
Yeah, my answer is absolutely no. Like I don't like them. I think they lose most of those head coaching battles. I was surprised they kept Nick around. And yeah, they're really talented. They're uber talented. Think about it. A.J. Brown, their long time. Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts, their offensive front. Like all of these things, they have so much more talent than the Bengals on paper. And heck, I said that going into that game, I think, how talented they were. I didn't even get to the defense where they just stole 2 first-round cornerbacks, and Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, and both guys producing. So it's one of those things where it's like, all right, you need a little luck, and they had luck in the draft. You also need the talent to outweigh the coaching element. And I think that's where the Bengals were at times. And so I would get retooling. We've also seen Lou have success when he has the right talent. And so, again, that's why I go back to the bigger picture, because and this gets into the front office a little bit, but if you're going to let guys like Jesse Bates leave because of guaranteed money, that means that it's going to be really, really hard to always have the edge talent-wise. You better have an edge coaching-wise, and like a significant one. And so you're talking about top 5 head coach, top 5 staff, you feel good about it. Well, it doesn't feel like the Bengals have either of those. And so, yeah, maybe you get the defensive coordinator right, but we're probably having the same conversation about the head coach going up against another head coach.
And then you get to the very difficult topic of, can this Bengals ownership group actually put together that staff? In reality. Sure. But in reality, right? Because of course they can. Of course they could decide to suddenly be an NFL front office that pays head coaches actual top of market money. Like, of course they could decide we're going to pay Ben Johnson $10 million or whatever his asking price is. I don't remember what it was. They could, but that's why it's a difficult question. What level of confidence is there that they're not going back to shop for the next big thing? And that's what they tried to do with Zac Taylor, right? They tried to go find a guy that could grow into being a top head coach in the NFL. They went to a QB's coach, right? Who had some interim OC experience, had some ties to the city. I don't think that the ties to the city were necessarily a factor, but maybe attracted him to Cincinnati to some degree. But had the experience with McVay, and they're like, okay, well, maybe we can get that next thing. The Matt LaFleur's or the Shanahan tree that's gone out and has been somewhat successful elsewhere, depending on which coach you're talking about. But they're looking for that tree descendant to grow into a head coach. And at this point, you know what Zac Taylor is, I think, in Cincinnati anyway. Maybe his head coaching career continues at some point elsewhere, and he has another shot at things, and maybe it goes differently in a different organization. And I'm not comparing him to Andy Reid, but when I think about like the need for a voice change, or a change of scenery even for a coach, and again, not comparing him to Andy Reid, but I think about, again, Philly when they fired Andy Reid after they came up short in the playoffs over and over. A little bit different, right? Like not a direct comparison, but it's just highlighting this occasional need to move on from a good head coach, even if you think Zac is a good head coach.
I think you could do the opposite end of the spectrum too. Is like, oh well, Kansas City didn't get scared away from Andy Reid because of that.
Yeah,
and they realized, oh well, he's still a really good coach. He was just in a situation, kind of wore thin, and well, it paid off, didn't it? And that's a different conversation. And again, there's still 5 games left. There's more here. I think we're going to get more. There's going to be more coach talk this week, Jake. I don't think we even really got to all of it. This is mostly the Zac episode, but I think we needed to have it because I think it should be a real conversation. Will it be? I don't know.
And it's important to have it now.
Yes.
Because
yes,
we should have said this probably at the top of the show. So for anyone who got to the end, the reason it's important to have it now is because of that dead cat bounce. This team, historically, they're all but eliminated, right? Maybe they win out from here. It's still like a 5% chance they make the playoffs, even if they win out from here. And then what happens to everything that got to this point?
Yep.
They finished with a 9-8 record, say. But that's why it's important to have the conversation now. Maybe the way they do it changes our thoughts on this, and we'll obviously talk about it the rest of the season. But there's a reason to have the conversation now when we've had all of these make or break games and we've seen the way they've gone.
Sure. Yeah. By the way, if Zac, if he was going to step in, I feel like it would have been 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, right? 2 weeks ago, but steps in this week, and we're recording this before his Monday press conference. And is like, I'm helping with the defense, and the defense is better. Well, then things change. There's ebbs and flows. That sounds very unrealistic, Jake. That's why I was comfortable. So things can change, but this idea that if they go 3-2 down the stretch and they beat Dallas and Tennessee and the Browns, whoop-de-doo. Or if the Steelers have nothing to prove in that final game and they play their backups, well, the Bengals can't stop Justin Fields anyway with the game on the line, so I'm not sure that's going to matter now, will it, Jake? So
I don't know if they even play Justin Fields. They might go third string to preserve Fields' health as well. Let's wrap
Duck
up
Hodges.
there.
It's not Duck anymore, by the way, but
I don't even know who it is.
They signed Duck Hodges to play the Bengals because that's how irrelevant that game is for them. Anyways, let's wrap up there.
Got plenty more to discuss this week as we try to find the things that are important to the Bengals for the rest of the season and keep in mind what's going on with this coaching staff, how the coaching staff responds, how the players respond. These are things that matter the rest of the way as well. Until next time, thanks for listening to this episode.
Kyle Allen. That's his name.
Great. I did see him on the sideline of the broadcast. Until next time, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.